"You built an empire out of numbers, Mr. Cole," she said quietly, her voice steady as winter light through glass. "But you never learned how to see people." The sentence did not echo, yet it seemed to settle into every corner of the 52nd floor, threading itself through steel beams and polished marble until even the skyline outside felt still. Ethan Cole remained seated behind his 12-foot walnut desk, the kind flown in from Northern California and finished by hand, a desk that had witnessed mergers worth billions and negotiations that reshaped markets. And yet nothing in his 38 years of calculated victories had prepared him for the calm in Amara Bennett's eyes as she stood alone in his office without a lawyer, without a witness, without even a tremor in her posture. Manhattan stretched behind her in panes of spotless glass, the Hudson River reflecting a pale afternoon sun, yellow cabs inching along Fifth Avenue like pieces on a board he believed he controlled. But in that suspended second, it was not the city that commanded the room. It was the woman in a navy dress and modest heels, a woman who had walked past reception, past assistants who avoided her gaze, past whispers that had already written her story without asking for her version. 3 days earlier, an internal audit had flagged discrepancies in a community investment fund she managed, small figures in the margins of quarterly reports, numbers that meant little to shareholders, but everything to neighborhoods in Queens and Newark where that money built after-school programs and renovated aging clinics, and the board had demanded swift accountability because markets preferred clarity over truth. Ethan had built his reputation on decisive action, on cutting loss before sentiment could cloud judgment. And when his chief financial officer suggested Amara might be the weak link, it felt efficient to believe it, efficient to summon her, efficient to prepare a termination letter printed on heavyweight paper that lay now inside the top drawer of his desk. He studied her as if she were a line item, taking in the subtle gold studs at her ears, the leather portfolio she held close to her chest, the way her shoulders remained squared despite the temperature of the room, which always ran at 68 degrees, precise and controlled like everything else in his tower. She had grown up 40 miles from here in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, worked her way through a state university on scholarships and double shifts, earned her position at Cole Industries not because of charity, but because her projections were sharper than analysts with Ivy League resumes. And yet none of those facts had been loud enough to drown out suspicion once it took root. When he first accused her that morning, his voice had been even, almost bored, as if disappointment were a routine maintenance cost, and she had listened without interruption, allowing the silence between his sentences to stretch until it revealed more about him than about her. Now that silence returned, heavier than the skyline, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar pressing against his ribs, not anger, not defensiveness, but the unsettling awareness that for the first time someone in this office was not intimidated by his title or his net worth or the framed magazine covers that lined the wall behind him. Amara did not raise her voice, did not plead, did not reference policy or threaten legal action. She simply held his gaze as though she were holding up a mirror polished enough to reflect not his success, but his blind spots. And outside the glass, clouds drifted across the sun, dimming the light just enough to make the room feel smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. The air between them did not shatter. It tightened, like a wire pulled one notch too far, and Ethan felt the unfamiliar weight of being measured rather than obeyed. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, the posture that had unsettled senators and competitors alike. Yet today it felt rehearsed, almost hollow. "Are you suggesting," he said carefully, each word spaced with executive precision, "that I do not know my own company?" Amara did not flinch. The late afternoon light shifted across the glass wall, tracing a pale line along her cheekbone, illuminating the quiet resolve there. "I am suggesting," she replied, her tone even and respectful, "that numbers can be arranged to tell any story you want them to tell, especially when someone powerful is in a hurry to believe the worst about someone who is not." The words did not accuse, they clarified, and that subtle difference unsettled him more than outrage would have. He opened the drawer and slid the audit summary across the desk, pages marked with discreet red tabs. "The discrepancies are real," he said. "So is the context," she answered, placing her leather portfolio on the desk with deliberate calm. She opened it and revealed neatly organized reports, time-stamped emails, and authorization forms that bore the digital signatures of 2 senior managers above her pay grade. The reallocation was approved in writing to cover emergency repairs at the Newark Youth Center after the January freeze, she explained. The funds were restored within the same quarter. The variance looks dramatic if you isolate it from the timeline, but it disappears when you view the full cycle. Ethan scanned the documents, recognition dawning not in a flash but in increments, like city lights flickering on at dusk. The signatures were familiar, belonging to executives who had attended his charity galas and shaken his hand on magazine covers. A muscle tightened along his jaw. Outside, a ferry moved slowly across the Hudson, steady and unbothered by the currents beneath it. "Why did you not bring this to the board yourself?" he asked. She met his gaze without defiance. "Because I was not invited into the room where the narrative was being written," she said. There was no bitterness in her voice, only fact. "I was told to wait in the hallway while decisions about my integrity were being discussed." The statement landed heavier than any accusation. Ethan remembered the meeting, remembered glancing at his watch as the board urged swift action, remembered how efficiency had felt like leadership. He had not asked who was absent. He had not considered what silence might cost the person standing outside the glass door. "You think this is about how I see you," he said, though it sounded less certain now. "I know it is," she replied softly. "If someone with a different background had submitted the same report, you would have asked for clarification before drafting termination papers." He felt heat rise behind his composed exterior, not anger at her, but discomfort at the possibility that she might be right. He had built his empire on the belief that he was objective, data-driven, immune to bias. That belief had been one of his proudest assets. She closed her portfolio gently. "I did not come here to beg for my position," she continued. "I came to protect my name. My mother taught me that when you walk into a room alone, you carry your whole history with you. I cannot afford to let mine be rewritten without truth." The simplicity of that statement unsettled him more than any legal threat could have. For the first time since founding Cole Industries at 29, Ethan felt the edges of his certainty soften. The glass around them no longer felt like a symbol of transparency, but of separation, a barrier that had kept him insulated from the human weight behind the spreadsheets. He looked again at the audit summary, then at the signatures above hers, then back at the woman who had chosen dignity over defense. "Leave the documents with me," he said quietly. The command carried less authority and more contemplation than before. Amara nodded once, not triumphantly, but with composed finality. "That is all I wanted," she said, and as she turned toward the door, the click of her heels against the marble floor echoed through the office, steady and unhurried, while Ethan remained seated behind a desk that suddenly felt larger than he had ever intended it to be. The door closed with a quiet click that sounded far louder in the stillness she left behind, and Ethan remained seated for several seconds, staring at the polished surface of his desk, as if it might rearrange the truth into something more convenient. The skyline beyond the glass had shifted into early evening, Manhattan glowing in gradients of amber and steel, yet the office felt dimmer than it had an hour ago. He reached for the audit summary again, this time not as a weapon but as evidence, and laid Amara's documents beside it, aligning the pages with deliberate care. The signatures of Thomas Green and Valerie Whitman stood out immediately, bold and confident, executives who had spoken at his leadership retreats about accountability and corporate responsibility. He pressed the intercom button, his voice controlled but no longer casual. "Have Mr. Green and Ms. Whitman come to my office within the hour," he instructed. When the line went silent, he leaned back and allowed himself a rare, uncomfortable thought. He had not asked enough questions. In his world, hesitation was weakness, yet now he understood that speed had disguised itself as strength. 40 minutes later, Thomas Green sat across from him, cuff links catching the lamplight, confidence practiced and polished. Valerie Whitman followed, tablet in hand, expression carefully neutral. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply turned the documents toward them and asked for clarification. For a fraction of a second, too small for anyone but a trained negotiator to notice, Thomas hesitated. Valerie's eyes flickered to the signature line and then away. Explanations followed, layered in corporate phrasing about temporary adjustments and verbal approvals. But the timelines did not align with the written authorizations Amara had provided. Ethan listened, silent, measuring not just their words but the space between them. Outside, the city lights sharpened against the darkening sky, reflections multiplying in the glass walls until the office appeared surrounded by mirrors. Why was the board informed before a full review was completed? He asked. Thomas offered an answer about urgency and optics. Valerie mentioned shareholder sensitivity. None of it satisfied the simple arithmetic of the facts before him. The realization settled slowly, not dramatic but decisive. The narrative had been convenient, and Amara had been expendable. He dismissed them without spectacle, promising a formal review by the end of the week. When the door closed again, the office felt larger, quieter, and less certain. Ethan stood and walked toward the window, hands resting lightly against the cool glass. 40 miles away, in neighborhoods his company's funds were meant to support, after-school lights would be turning on in renovated classrooms, children gathering under ceilings. Repaired with the very reallocation he had nearly punished. He imagined Amara leaving the building earlier, stepping into the evening air without looking back, dignity intact whether or not her position remained. For years he had believed fairness was automatic because he intended it to be. Now he understood that intention without attention was merely assumption. He returned to his desk and opened a new email, not to the board, not to the public relations team, but to the internal audit committee, requesting an immediate and transparent investigation into the fund approvals, including his own oversight. His fingers hovered briefly over the keyboard before he added one more line, instructing that no personnel action regarding Amara Bennett was to proceed until the review concluded. It was a small correction in the architecture of his empire, but it felt foundational. As he pressed send, the hum of the building's ventilation system seemed steadier, almost rhythmic, and for the first time that day he allowed himself to acknowledge that the most costly error he had almost made was not financial. It was human. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the sky above Manhattan carried a pale silver haze, and Ethan had already reviewed the fund documentation 3 times, each pass stripping away another layer of assumption. The internal audit committee had responded before sunrise, confirming that the emergency reallocation had been logged correctly, the authorization chain intact, and the only irregularity had been the speed with which the board had accepted a simplified summary instead of the full report. Thomas Green's and Valerie Whitman's explanations were now under formal review, and the tone of their follow-up messages had shifted from polished confidence to careful restraint. Ethan stood in his office, jacket folded over the back of his chair, tie loosened, not in defeat but in thought, as the early light reflected off the Hudson and cast long bands of brightness across the marble floor. He had built Cole Industries on the promise of disciplined leadership, yet discipline without humility had nearly cost him the integrity of someone who had done her job well. He pressed the intercom and requested that Amara Bennett be asked to return to the 52nd floor at her earliest convenience. When she stepped out of the elevator 20 minutes later, the reception area felt different from the day before. Conversations softened rather than sharpened, and the assistant who had once avoided her eyes now offered a quiet nod of respect. Amara walked down the corridor with the same measured stride, navy dress replaced by a charcoal blazer, posture unchanged. When she entered the office, Ethan did not remain behind the desk. Instead, he stood near the window, the skyline behind him no longer a shield but a backdrop. "The audit is complete," he said, his voice steady, not rehearsed. The fund reallocation was authorized and compliant. The summary presented to the board omitted context. That omission will be addressed. He did not speak in grand gestures or dramatic apologies. He spoke in facts, because facts were the language he trusted most. Amara listened without visible triumph, her expression composed. "Your record is clear," he continued. "No termination will occur. Instead, there will be a formal acknowledgement of your management of the Newark project and a restructuring of the review process to prevent this from happening again." For a moment, silence rested between them, not tense, but reflective. "Thank you for completing the review," she replied. Her tone held neither resentment nor gratitude exaggerated beyond proportion. It held balance. Ethan met her gaze fully this time, without the distance of presumption. "I owe you more than a procedural correction," he said after a measured pause. I owe you an apology. I moved too quickly. I allowed urgency to replace understanding. The words were simple, stripped of corporate varnish. Amara regarded him thoughtfully. Accountability is not weakness, she said quietly. It is leadership. The statement carried no instruction, only truth. Outside, a delivery truck idled 30 stories below, and a ferry carved a white line across the dark water. Ordinary movement, steady and unremarkable, yet purposeful. Ethan felt the architecture of his authority adjust slightly, not collapsing, but realigning. I would like you to present the full Newark report at the next board meeting, he added. Not as defense. As strategy. The company should hear directly from the person who understands the impact. A faint shift crossed her expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition that the room had changed. If the focus remains on the community outcomes and not on salvaging reputations, I will present, she answered. He inclined his head once. Agreement without negotiation. As she turned toward the door, the office no longer felt like a fortress of glass, but a space capable of transparency. Ethan remained by the window. After she left, watching the city move in quiet rhythm, aware that the most significant transformation within coal industries that week would not be recorded in quarterly earnings or stock prices. It would be measured in the space between assumption and attention, in the decision to see before deciding, and in the understanding that strength, when refined by humility, no longer needed to hide behind glass. The boardroom on the 48th floor had always been designed to intimidate, with a 20-foot slab of dark oak stretching the length of the space, and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a private exhibit. Yet that Thursday afternoon it felt less like a courtroom and more like a crossroads. 12 directors sat in tailored suits and understated jewelry, tablets open, expressions disciplined, while Ethan stood at the head of the table, not with a presentation remote, but with his hands resting lightly against the polished wood. He had introduced quarterly forecasts in this room, defended acquisitions worth billions, and announced restructurings that reshaped entire departments. But today he began differently. Before we move to projected growth, he said, his voice measured, carrying easily across the quiet, we need to address the Newark Youth Center allocation and the internal review that followed. A subtle shift moved around the table, not panic, but awareness. Amara sat midway down the right side, charcoal blazer crisp, documents aligned in front of her, posture steady. She had not asked to sit at the front. She did not need to. Ethan summarized the findings without embellishment, explaining the authorized reallocation, the omission of contextual data in the initial board briefing, and the corrective steps already implemented. He did not assign blame theatrically. He assigned responsibility precisely. When he finished, he turned toward Amara. Ms. Bennett will now present the full impact analysis of the Newark project and outline her recommendations for expanding community oversight metrics across future initiatives. There was no flourish in his introduction, only clarity. Amara rose smoothly, the faint sound of her chair moving against the hardwood floor the only interruption in the room's quiet. The screen behind her illuminated with images of renovated classrooms, upgraded heating systems, and attendance data reflecting improved after-school participation. Her voice was calm, deliberate, free of defensive undertones. She spoke of children who no longer needed to wear winter coats indoors, of local contractors hired from within the neighborhood, of long-term cost savings generated by preventive maintenance rather than reactive spending. She presented percentages and projections with the confidence of someone who knew the numbers intimately, but she also spoke of impact in terms that extended beyond spreadsheets. When capital flows with context, she said, clicking to the final slide, it does more than preserve margins. It preserves trust. The words were not directed at anyone in particular, yet they landed across the table with quiet weight. Questions followed, detailed and occasionally skeptical, but Amara answered each with composure, referencing data sets, timelines, and contingency plans. As she concluded, the room did not erupt into applause, because this was not that kind of arena, but several directors exchanged nods that carried more meaning than sound. Ethan observed without interruption, recognizing that the authority in the room had subtly recalibrated. After the meeting adjourned, a few board members lingered to ask Amara about replicating the Newark model in other cities. Thomas Green remained seated longer than usual, eyes lowered to his tablet, the confidence that once defined his posture now tempered by caution. Later, as the sun dipped westward and cast long streaks of amber across the skyline, Ethan returned to his office and stood once more before the glass. The city looked unchanged, traffic threading through avenues, ferries cutting clean lines through the river, but something within the tower had shifted. He understood now that leadership was not proven in how swiftly one could remove perceived weakness, but in how honestly one could confront error. A memo would go out the next morning formalizing the revised review process, embedding transparency into procedures that once relied too heavily on assumption. Yet the most significant change would not appear in any corporate announcement. It would live in the quieter decisions, the extra question asked before judgment, the invitation extended before conclusions were drawn. Below, the evening lights flickered on one by one, and for the first time in many years, Ethan felt that the glass surrounding his empire reflected not just power, but perspective. In the weeks that followed, the change inside coal industries did not arrive with banners or headlines. It unfolded in smaller, steadier ways, like sunlight stretching a few minutes longer each evening. A revised review protocol was circulated company-wide, outlining mandatory contextual analysis before any personnel action, and Ethan insisted his own name appear at the top of the document as sponsor of the reform. Some executives interpreted it as strategic optics, others as damage control. But those who had watched the board meeting understood it was neither. It was recalibration. Amara returned to her office on the 32nd floor without fanfare. Yet the atmosphere around her desk felt different. Colleagues who once offered polite distance now asked for her input on community models and long-term sustainability metrics. She responded with the same measured professionalism she had always carried, neither savoring the shift nor dismissing it. Dignity, she believed, did not fluctuate with public opinion. One late afternoon, as Manhattan's skyline glowed in soft amber and traffic along the West Side Highway moved in patient lines, Ethan stepped out of the elevator on her floor unannounced. Conversations paused subtly, not out of fear but curiosity. He walked without entourage, jacket buttoned, expression thoughtful rather than commanding. When he reached her office door, he knocked. Once before entering, Amara looked up from a series of projection charts spread neatly across her desk. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. The simplicity of the question carried more weight than any directive. She gestured to the chair opposite her. He sat, taking in the modest space compared to the expanse of his own office 30 floors above. Framed photographs of community events lined one shelf, children holding books, volunteers repainting walls, a winter coat drive captured in bright scarves and determined smiles. "I visited Newark this morning," he said, folding his hands loosely. "I wanted to see the center after the repairs." She regarded him with quiet attention. "The heating system is working well," she replied. "Attendance increased 12% this quarter," he nodded. "I spoke with the director. She told me the renovation allowed them to keep their literacy program open through the winter." A brief silence settled between them, not strained but reflective. "You were right," he continued. "Capital without context is incomplete." The admission was not theatrical. It was grounded. Amara considered his words carefully. "Context requires proximity," she said. "It is difficult to understand impact from behind a boardroom table." He absorbed that without defensiveness. Outside her window, the river shimmered under the lowering sun, ferries tracing quiet paths across its surface. "I built this company on the idea that efficiency solves problems," he said. "But efficiency without perspective creates new ones." She leaned back slightly, studying him not as a superior, but as a man recalculating his framework. "Perspective is learned," she answered. "It is not inherited with a title." The corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly, not in amusement, but in recognition. "Then I intend to keep learning," he said. There was no grand proposal attached to the statement, no sudden transformation into sentiment, only an intention, deliberate and measured. When he rose to leave, he paused at the doorway. "Thank you for not allowing your silence to be mistaken for agreement," he added. She met his gaze evenly. "Thank you for listening when it mattered," she replied, as he walked back toward the elevator. The building's polished floors reflected the fading daylight, and Ethan understood that the empire he had spent a decade constructing was not weakened by this shift. It was strengthened, not by dominance, but by awareness, and somewhere between the 32nd floor and the 52nd, in the quiet hum of cables and steel, the distance between assumption and understanding narrowed, not dramatically, but permanently. Autumn settled over Manhattan with a kind of deliberate grace, the air turning crisp enough to sharpen breath and thought, and coal industries moved through the season with a steadier rhythm. The revised oversight model had already been adopted in 2 additional cities, and weekly briefings now included a standing agenda item labeled Community Impact Review, a phrase that had once lived at the margins of spreadsheets and now occupied the center of discussion. Ethan noticed the shift not in headlines, but in tone, in the way senior executives asked more layered questions, in the way younger analysts spoke with a confidence that did not require permission. One Tuesday morning, as a soft rain traced silver lines down the glass facade of the building, he reviewed a proposal for expanding after-school technology labs in Newark and Chicago. Instead of approving it alone, he forwarded the document to Amara with a brief message requesting her assessment before the afternoon meeting. The response arrived within the hour, concise and thorough, outlining both potential risks and long-term gains, suggesting adjustments that balanced ambition with sustainability. He read her analysis twice, not out of doubt but respect. Later that afternoon, in the boardroom where authority once felt immovable, he referenced her recommendations directly, crediting her by name. There was no hesitation in his voice, no guarded phrasing, only acknowledgement. Across the table, several directors took notes, and one asked if Ms. Bennett would be willing to join the strategy subcommittee as a permanent advisor. When the meeting concluded, Ethan did not immediately retreat to his office. Instead, he walked with Amara down the corridor, the muted hum of the building surrounding them. "You should consider this subcommittee role," he said. "Your perspective would strengthen it." She glanced toward the rain-blurred skyline before answering. "Perspective only strengthens a room when the room is willing to change," she replied. He absorbed that quietly. "It is," he said after a moment. "It has to be." Days later, on a clear Saturday morning, Ethan drove himself to Newark without security detail or formal announcement. The youth center buzzed with weekend activity, children clustered around refurbished computers, volunteers organizing donated books along freshly painted walls. Amara stood near a bulletin board, reviewing attendance charts with the center director. When she noticed him, her expression did not harden or soften. It remained composed. "I wanted to see the technology lab before expansion," he explained. She nodded and walked him through the space, explaining bandwidth upgrades, maintenance schedules, and projected enrollment increases. He listened not as a benefactor, but as a student. Sunlight streamed through wide windows, illuminating dust motes that shimmered like quiet proof of effort. "When I started this company," he said as they paused near a row of desks, "I believe scale was the measure of success." She folded her hands lightly. "Scale matters," she answered, "but direction matters more." The simplicity of the statement lingered long after the children returned to their screens. As they stepped outside, the air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant river water. Traffic moved steadily along the nearby avenue, ordinary and persistent. Ethan realized that the most profound shifts in his leadership were not dramatic reversals, but disciplined recalibrations, choices made repeatedly until they formed habit. And as he looked at the center standing warm and active behind them, he understood that what had once felt like a challenge to his authority had become an expansion of it, not diminishing his strength but refining it, proving that power grounded in awareness did not fracture under scrutiny, it evolved. Winter approached without announcement, slipping into Manhattan on a clear wind that sharpened the edges of skyscrapers and turned the Hudson a deeper shade of steel. And inside coal industries, the quarterly strategy summit gathered executives from across the country. The auditorium on the 25th floor filled with department heads, regional directors, and analysts whose careers had been shaped by Ethan's relentless standard of performance. This year, however, the agenda carried a new emphasis: community impact integration, printed in bold along the program's center column. Ethan stood at the podium beneath soft white lights, not with his usual crisp certainty alone, but with measured intention. He outlined revenue forecasts, expansion plans, and operational efficiencies with the same precision that had defined his leadership for a decade. Yet when he reached the midpoint of his presentation, he paused, allowing the silence to settle. Growth without awareness is unstable, he said evenly, his voice carrying through the room. We have learned that recently. There was no elaboration, no dramatics, only acknowledgement. He then invited Amara to the stage. A subtle murmur passed through the audience, curiosity mixed with respect. She walked forward in a deep blue dress beneath a structured blazer, posture calm, steps unhurried. The projection screen behind her displayed images from Newark, Chicago, and now Baltimore, community centers bright with activity. She did not speak of past misunderstandings or personal vindication. She spoke of measurable outcomes. Attendance increases, improved digital literacy rates, and the long-term fiscal advantage of preventative investment. Her voice was steady, articulate, and clear enough to reach the back row without strain. When we align capital with community realities, she explained, we do not reduce profit. We protect it by building trust that lasts longer than a quarter. The data on the screen supported her assertion, graphs rising in disciplined arcs. Executives who once equated community spending with expense now saw it reframed as strategic resilience. Ethan observed from a slight distance, not overshadowing her presence, recognizing that influence shared was not influence diminished. After the summit concluded, small clusters formed throughout the auditorium, conversations shifting toward replication models and oversight transparency. Several regional directors approached Amara with questions about implementation timelines and partnership vetting. She answered with patience and specificity, careful to ground each idea in sustainable structure rather than idealistic impulse. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered on against an indigo sky, Ethan stood again by the glass wall of his office, jacket resting across one arm. Below, traffic streamed along avenues in disciplined lines, headlights reflecting against wet pavement from an earlier flurry. He thought back to the afternoon she had stood alone in this same room, to the sentence that had unsettled him more than any market downer. He understood now that leadership required more than confidence in one's own judgment. It required courage to revise it. A soft knock interrupted his reflection. Amara entered, holding a folder of updated projections. The Baltimore site will require an additional $200,000 in contingency reserves, she said. The neighborhood infrastructure is older than initial reports suggested. He accepted the folder and scanned the summary. Approve it, he replied without hesitation. She met his gaze briefly, acknowledging the decision. There was no dramatic exchange, no grand proclamation, only the quiet evidence of trust. As she left, the office lights reflected faintly against the glass, merging with the city beyond. Ethan remained there a moment longer, aware that the empire he once believed was defined solely by valuation and scale had grown in a dimension less visible but far more enduring. And in the steady hum of heating systems and distant sirens, he recognized that the most powerful transformations are rarely announced. They are practiced, day after day, until perspective becomes principle and principle becomes culture. By late January, the city carried a sharper edge, the wind slicing between towers and pressing against the glass facade of Cole Industries as if testing its strength. And inside the executive conference room, a different kind of pressure gathered. Quarterly earnings had exceeded projections. Yet an external investment firm had released a critical report questioning the company's increased allocation toward community infrastructure, labeling it idealistic rather than strategic. Headlines moved quickly, markets faster, and within 48 hours analysts were asking whether Cole Industries had drifted from its disciplined focus. Ethan sat at the head of the long oak table, the report displayed across a large screen, its language precise and skeptical. Several directors shifted in their seats, concerned not about morality but about perception. Thomas Green, more cautious now than in months past, suggested scaling back visible community expenditures to reassure shareholders. The room fell quiet, waiting for the decision that would define direction. Ethan's gaze moved from the report to the faces around the table, then to the skyline beyond the glass, winter sunlight reflecting off steel and river water. He understood the familiar pull of retreat, the instinct to return to simpler narratives of profit and efficiency. But he also understood something else. The cost of abandoning conviction at the first sign of resistance. "Invite Ms. Bennett," he said evenly. Moments later, Amara entered, her posture calm despite the tension she sensed. Ethan summarized the external criticism without embellishment and then turned to her. "If we respond with clarity," he said, "not defensiveness." Amara nodded once and stepped toward the screen. She did not challenge the report's skepticism emotionally. She addressed it structurally. She outlined how the Newark and Chicago initiatives had reduced long-term maintenance liabilities by 15%, how improved community trust had increased local partnerships, lowering regulatory friction and expediting project approvals. She presented comparative charts showing stability in districts where engagement had deepened versus volatility where it had not. "The market values predictability," she concluded, her voice steady and measured. "Community stability contributes directly to operational predictability." A director asked whether the strategy risked alienating short-term investors. Amara answered without hesitation. "Short-term confidence built on narrow metrics is fragile. Long-term resilience built on integrated impact is durable." The room absorbed the distinction. Ethan watched not as a patron, but as a leader aligned. He then addressed the board. "We will release a formal statement outlining the measurable returns of our community integration model," he said. "We will not reduce investment because of external discomfort. We will clarify the strategy." The decision settled into the room with quiet authority. Later that evening, as snow began to fall in light, deliberate flakes across Midtown, Ethan stood alone in his office reviewing the draft response prepared by communications. He removed exaggerated language and replaced it with data, transparency, and accountability. He requested that Amara's analysis be appended in full, not summarized. When the statement went public the next morning, it did not spark applause, but it reframed the narrative. Financial commentators began referencing coal industries as disciplined yet forward-looking, and within days the market steadied. In her office on the 32nd floor, Amara read the published statement and noted the absence of spectacle. It was factual, precise, grounded. She closed her laptop and looked out at the snowfall gathering softly along the riverbanks. She understood that progress was not proven by a single board meeting or headline, but by consistency under scrutiny. And as winter light filtered through the glass, reflecting both the city's resilience and the company's evolving culture, it became clear that what had begun as a single sentence in a quiet office had matured into a principle strong enough to withstand the season's cold. By early March, the snow along the Hudson had thinned into gray traces at the edges of sidewalks, and Manhattan moved with the cautious optimism of a city sensing spring. Inside Coal Industries, the annual shareholder meeting approached, a gathering that traditionally celebrated growth charts and strategic acquisitions beneath the glow of chandeliers in a midtown ballroom. This year, however, anticipation carried a quieter undertone. Shaped by months of recalibration, Ethan stood alone in his office the night before the event, reviewing his keynote address. The skyline beyond the glass washed in a soft indigo haze. He had removed the usual openings centered on expansion milestones and instead began with a reflection on responsibility. He understood that leadership was tested not when applause was guaranteed, but when conviction faced scrutiny. The next evening, beneath crystal light and polished brass, investors, analysts, and media representatives filled round tables draped in white linen. The air hummed with conversation and the faint clink of glassware. When Ethan stepped onto the stage, the room settled into attentive quiet. He spoke first of performance, outlining revenue increases, operational efficiencies, and steady market recovery after winter volatility. The figures were strong, the projections disciplined. Then he shifted. "We have learned," he said evenly, "that sustainable growth is not measured solely in quarterly returns, but in the stability of the communities that surround our operations." A subtle ripple moved through the audience. He continued, referencing the Newark, Chicago, and Baltimore initiatives not as charitable gestures, but as strategic investments rooted in long-term resilience. He described reduced maintenance costs, improved local partnerships, and enhanced regulatory trust. The language was precise, the tone unembellished. Midway through his address, he invited Amara to join him on stage. dressed in a tailored cream blazer beneath the ballroom lights. She carried herself with the same steady composure that had once unsettled him in his office. Together they presented data that connected community infrastructure to operational predictability, graphs rising in deliberate arcs across the large screens. Amara's voice was clear, articulate, and grounded. She spoke of literacy programs, technology labs, and measurable workforce readiness outcomes. When businesses invest with awareness, she said, they build ecosystems that return value in ways that extend beyond a single fiscal year. The statement did not seek applause. It offered perspective. Questions followed from analysts seated near the front, probing margins and risk exposure. Amara answered with clarity, citing figures that demonstrated stability across multiple quarters. Ethan stood beside her not as a guardian of authority, but as a partner in principle. By the close of the presentation, the tone in the room had shifted from skepticism to consideration. As guests filtered toward dessert tables and quiet conversations resumed, several institutional investors approached to express support for the integrated model. Outside the ballroom, tall windows revealed the city shimmering against the dark river, bridges outlined in steady light. Later that night, back in his office high above the avenue, Ethan loosened his tie and looked out across the expanse of glass and steel that once defined his singular focus. He remembered the afternoon months earlier when a single sentence had unsettled his certainty. Now, the empire before him felt neither diminished nor threatened. It felt grounded. Amara's reflection appeared faintly in the glass as she stepped into the office with a folder of post-event feedback. The response was measured, she said. Most are willing to see where this leads. He nodded, aware that transformation rarely announced itself with fanfare. It revealed itself in steadiness under light. As they stood there overlooking the city's quiet persistence, the distance between power and perspective seemed no longer a divide but a bridge, built not in spectacle, but in sustained choice. Spring arrived gradually, not with spectacle, but with longer light stretching across the Hudson and soft green beginning to edge the trees lining Riverside Park. And within Coal Industries, the atmosphere carried a steadier confidence that did not rely on headlines. The shareholder meeting had concluded without disruption. The market had responded with cautious respect, and internal teams had begun integrating the community impact framework into long-term strategic planning. Yet for Ethan, the most significant shift was less visible, unfolding in the quieter spaces between decisions. One afternoon, he requested a comprehensive review of executive-level recruitment and promotion metrics, not as a public initiative, but as an internal audit of perspective. He had realized that systems shaped culture long before speeches ever could. The Human Resources Division compiled data over several weeks, analyzing patterns across departments, identifying where advancement pipelines narrowed and where mentorship access favored familiarity over merit. When the report reached his desk, he read it without defensiveness, aware that leadership required the courage to examine its own architecture. Later that week, he invited Amara to join a newly formed advisory council tasked with refining leadership development standards. It was not a ceremonial title, but a structural one, embedded within governance. She considered the offer carefully. If this council exists to affirm what already feels comfortable, I am not the right person, she said calmly. He met her gaze evenly. It exists to challenge what is, he replied. The simplicity of the exchange carried more meaning than a formal contract. In the months that followed, the advisory council met regularly, reviewing policies that once passed unquestioned. Mentorship programs were redesigned to prioritize access over proximity, and performance evaluations began incorporating community impact contributions alongside financial metrics. Some executives resisted, quietly, uncomfortable with recalibration, yet the structure held because it was supported from the top. Outside, the city shifted fully into spring, cafe tables reappearing along sidewalks, sunlight reflecting brightly off the glass towers that had once felt impenetrable. One evening, as the workday thinned and the building settled into its evening hum, Ethan stood again before the broad windows of his office, watching the river move in patient currents. Amara entered with a folder of updated leadership metrics, the numbers reflecting incremental but measurable change. The mentorship participation rate increased by 18% this quarter, she noted. Cross-departmental collaboration is improving. He accepted the report and allowed himself a small nod. Progress rarely announces itself loudly, he said. She offered a faint, knowing smile. It prefers consistency, she answered. The distance between them no longer felt defined by hierarchy, but by shared stewardship. What had begun as a confrontation had evolved into partnership, not rooted in sentiment, but in aligned principle. Ethan understood now that power refined by perspective did not weaken. It matured. And as twilight deepened over Manhattan, casting a soft glow across steel and stone, he recognized that the most enduring transformation within his company would not be traced to a single policy or public address. It would be traced to a willingness to listen when it mattered, to revise when necessary, and to lead with clarity that extended beyond profit into purpose. In the steady reflection of the glass before him, the city appeared unchanged, yet the man who watched it had learned that strength without awareness was incomplete, and awareness, once embraced, reshaped everything it touched. By early summer, the air over Manhattan carried warmth that softened the edges of steel and stone, and the windows of Cole Industries reflected a city alive with movement and light. Nearly a year had passed since a single afternoon altered the direction of its leadership, and what once felt like recalibration had matured into rhythm. Quarterly reports now included a dedicated section titled Integrated Stability Index, a metric combining financial performance with community engagement data, and analysts who once questioned its relevance now referenced it as a predictor of long-term resilience. Inside the 52nd floor boardroom, the advisory council convened for its annual review, sunlight pouring across the long oak table and illuminating stacks of reports that documented incremental yet undeniable progress. Mentorship access had expanded across divisions, recruitment pipelines reflected broader outreach, and operational partnerships in Newark, Chicago, and Baltimore had strengthened local networks that reduced risk exposure during economic fluctuations. Ethan listened as department heads presented findings, his presence no longer defined by control alone, but by attentiveness. When Amara delivered the final summary, her voice carried steady authority. "The stability we measure now is not accidental," she said. "Is the result of consistent choice." The room absorbed the statement with quiet agreement. After the meeting concluded, Ethan remained seated for a moment, fingertips resting lightly against the table's polished surface. He recalled the earlier days when speed had been mistaken for strength, when certainty had overshadowed curiosity. Outside, boats traced white lines along the river, and the city's bridges shimmered under bright afternoon light. Later that week, Cole Industries hosted an open forum for employees across departments, a voluntary gathering designed to discuss leadership development and long-term impact. The auditorium filled beyond capacity, folding chairs added along the aisles. Ethan and Amara stood side by side on the stage, not as symbols of hierarchy, but as evidence of evolution. Questions came from analysts in their 20s and managers nearing retirement. Inquiries about career pathways, community partnerships, and the meaning of accountability. Ethan answered candidly, acknowledging past assumptions without dramatizing them. Amara spoke of opportunity as responsibility, of ensuring that systems remained transparent and accessible. There was no theatrical applause, only a sense of collective engagement. As evenings settled and employees filtered out into the warm air, Ethan lingered near the glass entrance, watching the city glow in hues of gold and deep blue. Amara joined him, holding a folder of feedback forms collected from the forum. "The responses are thoughtful," she said. "People feel heard." He nodded slowly. "Hearing is different from listening," he replied. "We learned that the hard way." She regarded him with the same composed steadiness that had once unsettled him. "Learning is only valuable when it changes action," she answered. He understood the truth in that without defense. The distance between them had long since shifted from confrontation to collaboration, not defined by sentiment, but by shared discipline. As traffic moved steadily along the avenue and the glass facade reflected the rhythm of the city, Ethan recognized that leadership was no longer about proving certainty. It was about sustaining clarity, and in the steady pulse of summer evening light, he understood that the empire he had built was strongest not when it towered above scrutiny, but when it stood open to it. grounded in the quiet principle that perspective, once embraced, reshapes every measure of success. Late September arrived with a clear sky stretched wide above Manhattan, the kind of blue that made glass towers look almost transparent, and from the 52nd floor of Cole Industries the city appeared both vast and intimate at once. A year had passed since a quiet confrontation had shifted the course of leadership within those walls, and the change now felt less like an adjustment and more like identity. The annual impact report lay open across Ethan's desk, its pages detailing not only revenue growth but expanded literacy rates in Newark, increased internship placements in Chicago, and measurable workforce readiness improvements in Baltimore. Numbers that once stood alone now stood beside context. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, sunlight reflecting across the river in steady bands of gold. Below, traffic moved in disciplined patterns, a reminder that systems, when aligned, create rhythm rather than chaos. A soft knock sounded behind him. Amara entered, carrying the finalized draft of the upcoming strategic vision statement. Her posture remained composed, her presence steady as ever. "The language is precise," she said, handing him the folder. "It reflects what we have practiced, not just what we intend." He reviewed the opening paragraph, noting how the statement emphasized transparency, integrated growth, and accountability rooted in measurable outcomes. There was no ornamentation, no exaggerated claims, only clarity. "This will be presented to the board and published publicly," he said. She inclined her head slightly. "Then it should be accurate." He closed the folder and regarded her for a moment, not as a subordinate, not even solely as an advisor, but as a catalyst whose steadiness had forced him to reconsider what leadership required. "You once said context requires proximity," he reflected. "You were right." She met his gaze calmly. "Proximity is not just physical," she replied. "It is intentional." The word lingered between them, simple and exact. Outside, a ferry cut across the Hudson, leaving a bright line against deep water. Ethan understood now that the empire he had built was not defined only by scale or valuation, but by the willingness to see fully before deciding firmly. That afternoon, the company gathered in the main auditorium for the official release of the strategic vision statement. Employees filled the seats, some standing along the walls, sunlight streaming through high windows and casting warm light across polished floors. Ethan stepped to the podium, his voice steady as he spoke of growth achieved, lessons learned, and the responsibility that accompanied influence. He acknowledged the evolution of the company culture without dramatizing its origin when he invited Amara to join him. The applause that followed was not thunderous but sincere. She addressed the audience with composed assurance, outlining the roadmap ahead and emphasizing that integrity was not a temporary initiative but a permanent standard. As the event concluded and colleagues dispersed into corridors bright with late afternoon light, Ethan remained near the stage for a moment, watching conversations unfold organically. Managers speaking with analysts, directors listening rather than instructing. The building no longer felt like a fortress of glass but a structure of openness. Later, as dusk settled softly over the city and office lights reflected against the river, Ethan stood once more by the window, aware that the most significant transformation had not been financial or structural but internal. He had learned that strength refined by awareness does not fracture under challenge, it deepens. And in the quiet glow of Manhattan's evening, he recognized that the single moment which once unsettled his certainty had ultimately strengthened his leadership, proving that when perspective guides power, success endures with clarity rather than conquest.